let's get to the reason we're all here tonight. April Dunford. I got to know April speaking at some product conferences. I heard her speak. She was a great speaker. So I'm really excited to host her tonight to talk to us about positioning Jujitsu, how to win against powerful competitors. She is a founder and consultant of Ambient strategy. So she's a hands-on consultant helping companies with the positioning topic she's going to be talking about tonight. Prior to that, I didn't realize that she's CEO of Sprintly. So Sprintly, some of you may know, be familiar with that agile tool, an easy to use agile tool. She's on the board and an advisor and investor in a lot of different companies. She's a great speaker, and she wrote the book, Obviously Awesome, which, as I mentioned, is doing really well on Amazon. You can reach her on Twitter at April Dunford. Her website is aprildunford.com. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, April. Welcome.
So thanks everybody for coming. I'm April. Today, what I thought I would talk about is I would talk about positioning. If you guys know my work at all, I'm a positioning expert. Positioning is kind of my jam. But specifically, I thought what I would talk about today is positioning within the context of how does positioning actually help you win against different kinds of competition. And it's interesting, like when we think about our products do not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a context of competitors. And what's really interesting is if you think about products and the stages that a customer goes through when they're making a purchase, you actually have kind of different kinds of competitors to worry about at different stages. So you can think about it this way. If I'm trying to make a purchase, the first thing I got to do is kind of figure out who I should pay attention to and who I shouldn't. So I got to kind of narrow down a short list. After I get to that, I got to actually pick a winner and say, okay, I'm actually going to go with this one. And then interestingly, in order for me to actually adopt something new, I got to switch from whatever it was I was doing before. So if we think about that from a competitor perspective, narrowing down the short list is I got to kind of sift through all the other options out there. And at that point, the thing I'm competing with here is the hordes. When I'm picking a winner, interestingly, if I've kind of managed to beat the hordes, there's still usually a big competitor in there that I got to worry about, even if they're not directly competitive with me. And I call this one the giant. And then lastly, in order to actually switch, we got to compete with probably the most fearsome competitor of them all, which is the ghost. I'll talk about that one last. So let's talk about the hordes. So we got a lot of competitors, like in every market. Like, people love to show this one. Marketers in particular love to show this one. This is like, if you imagine all the software in the world, this is some guy's attempt to model all the companies that compete in the marketing technology space. And I think there's something like 7,000 companies on this slide or 8,000 companies on this slide. But it's not just MarTech that's really complicated. Like, I can pretty much produce a slide like this for any possible market that you might be in. Like, here's sales tech, looks like this. Here's data and AI. I had a guy come up to me at a conference last year and said, well, I don't know if that's true, April. Like, sometimes we're in really niche-y things. And so he started telling me that he was in the drone technology market space. And I was like, I bet I could find a slide for that one too. And yep, sure enough, here's the drone market environment in 2018. It's not good looking either. So how do we actually beat the hordes? And in my opinion, there's a couple ways you could do this. So the first one is you only fight battles where you can win. So, and that sounds obvious, but it's interesting how often, particularly if we're working at a startup, how frequently we are kind of unintentionally positioned in a market space where we can't actually win. So I would give you two examples, and the first one is just straight up stupid, but it's kind of hopefully illustrative of how this works. And then I'm going to give you another one that looks more like tech. So here's my non-tech example. Let's say, like, for a minute, right? We're not tech people, and what we are instead is we're bakers. And I'm a baker, and my specialty is chocolate cake. And I get up one morning and I say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to innovate the heck out of chocolate cake. And you know what I got? I want to make chocolate cake where I can drink a coffee in one hand and eat chocolate cake in the other hand, like sort of a chocolate cakey snack. thing. And so I fool around with it. I make the cake kind of small. I figure out how to make it portable, and I come up with this thing on the slide on the right. This is my innovative thing. And I've tested it out with people. They love it. Everybody loves my new innovative cake thing. So I get this bright idea. I'm going to sell this at Starbucks. So I'm going to call up the gal at Starbucks who's responsible for buying new snacks and things. I'm going to pitch her on my innovative cake thing. So I call up the lady at Starbucks and I'm like, hey, Starbucks lady, I got this thing. It's cake, but it's innovative cake. And here's what it is. I actually took the cake and I made it kind of small, like sort of like a morsel of cake. And then I decided I wanted to make it portable. So I give it kind of a handle. It's not really a handle. It's kind of like a stick. And so what I have is this innovative, new, fantastic, next generation cake on a stick thing. And the gal at Starbucks, she's like, no, that's not what you did. What you made there, that's Franken cake. That's cake doing things cake wasn't meant to do. That's no good. Now, why does that pitch not work? Is because I positioned it as cake. Like right out of the gate. I'm like, I got this thing as cake. And what wins a cake contest? The cakiest cake in the land. That's what wins. And what do I want in cake? I want a big piece. I don't want a small piece. I want frosting, and I want a lot of frosting. I want premium ingredients. I want and what's cool about your thing? Like your thing hits the ball and a stick and a whole bunch of stuff that is just fundamentally not cake. So I have positioned this thing in a way where it just can't win. I'm in a cake contest. Cakier Cake is going to win a cake contest. I got a thing that just looks like cake doing stuff cake wasn't meant to do. Now, my point here is positioning in a category like that is going to determine how you get evaluated. Now, I could have positioned this thing in a totally different way. I could have called up the Starbucks lady and said, hey, you know what? You know what I got? I got this idea. What if we had a lollipop? But it's not a lollipop. It's a lollipop for grown-ups in the coffee shop. So I made it out of cake. Now that's a whole different thing. If I'm positioned it as a lollipop, well, of course it's got a stick. Of course it's got a ball. All that stuff makes sense. And if I'm specifically trying to win the coffee shop grown-up market for lollipops, this thing is a winner. So my best category takes all the things that make me special and neat and amazing, and it puts them right in the center of the category that I'm positioned in. Okay, so that's my stupid cake example. Now I'm going to give you like a proper tech example. This is a story about by people in Waterloo that are attending will know these folks. They're in Waterloo. There's a company called ClearPath Robotics, started by a couple of guys with advanced degrees in mechatronics engineering. They're robot guys, so they start a startup making what? Robots. And specifically, the thing they've developed is it's a robot that drives around a manufacturing plant. And what it does is it delivers things from one place to the other. Now, if you don't know a lot about robotics, maybe you think that doesn't sound like a super hard problem to solve, but it turns out this thing is full of mapping and sensors and artificial intelligence, and it is like a miracle of modern robot technology. So they come up with this thing. They get meetings with the folks at a manufacturing plant that buy robots, and they come in and they say, hey, we're ClearPath Robotics, and we're here to talk to you about our fancy new robot. And the minute they say that, folks buy robots, manufacturing plants are like, robots. We got robots, man. We've been buying robots for decades. You know what? We have approved robot vendors, and you're not one of them. Your robot seems kind of expensive compared to all the other robots. And the ClearPath guys are like, no, you don't understand. We're special robots. We're special. We're new. We're innovative. We're like robots you've never seen before. And so it takes them like 19 sales meetings before they get this idea of, we're not a thing that picks up a roll of tape and puts it in a box. We're actually this other thing. So eventually they get this idea, like maybe positioning this thing as a robot is not doing us any favors. maybe we need to position it in another way. So they take a step back and they're like, what makes us special and different and neat, right? Well, it's mobility, it's moving around, it's mapping, it's sensors, it's artificial intelligence. What category can we position ourselves in? Like what moves around and has mapping and sensors and artificial intelligence? And eventually what they came up with is maybe what we've actually built is a self-driving car. In fact, they position it as autonomous vehicles for industrial uses, but a self-driving car for manufacturing. They position it that way, and they're like, of course it drives around. Of course it's got artificial intelligence and sensors and mappings and stuff. That's what we know about self-driving cars. And of course, I am not going to get that from the same vendor that picks up a piece of tape and puts it in a cardboard box. I expect that to be more expensive and different and come from a different vendor. One of the things I like about this example is how that positioning actually filtered through to everything, even including the industrial design of the product itself. So if you look at the picture of it, they have like white headlights at the front and red taillights at the back. Those actually don't do anything. It's a robot. It doesn't need headlights and taillights, but it's there to drive home this positioning of, this is an autonomous vehicle. So if this is so important, how do I actually get it done? And, how we do this is we actually need to figure out our best possible positioning for the product that we're working on. Now, positioning is a tragically misunderstood concept. When I talk about it, a lot of people say, well, isn't that just messaging, or isn't that the same thing as branding? And it's not, actually. Positioning is a thing you got to do first. It's an input to all those things. In my definition, positioning defines how our product is the best in the world at providing some kind of value that a well-defined set of customers cares a lot about. Now that's a mouthful. That's because positioning is actually made up of a bunch of different components. I can break positioning down into 5 component pieces, and here's what they are. So the first is competitive alternatives. So, who do I actually compete against out in the market? Secondly is unique attributes or features. Like, what do I have that the competitors don't have? That's a piece of my positioning. I need to understand the value that my product delivers for customers. And then I need to understand what customers, like who am I actually trying to go after here? So I need to understand my segmentation, who I'm going after. And the last bit is this idea of market category, which is what is the context I can position my product in that makes this value obvious to these people? Am I cake or lollipop? Am I a robot or a self-driving car? Now, when we look at this, we're trying to figure out how to get our best positioning. The first thing you got to realize is that each of these components has a relationship to the others. So I can pick anything on this slide. Let me pick value. The differentiated value that I can deliver for customers is entirely dependent on my unique features. But my unique features are only unique if I compare them to a competitive alternative. So those things are all related. I can't figure them out separately. My customer segments, my best fit customers, are the customers that really, really care a lot about the value that I can deliver. And then market category, that has a relationship to both value and customer segments. It's the context where this value makes sense to these people. So you get into this thing where if I'm going to figure out positioning, I actually have to figure out each of these pieces in a very particular order. And it kind of goes like this. I actually have to start with competitive alternatives. And then I say, what do I got that they don't have? That gives me unique features. I can take those features, I can translate them into value. That gets me to a differentiated value proposition. Once I have the value, then I can say, what are the characteristics of a target customer that makes them care a lot about my value? And then once I have those two things, I can say, all right, what's my best market category that makes this value obvious to these people? Now, there's a boatload of ways you can screw this up. The most common one is the wrong starting point. So you would think it's obvious who we compete with, but it often isn't. And I probably have a dozen conversations a week with startups that come to me and I say, hey, who do you compete with? And they'll say, oh, I compete with all these startups, and they'll give me some big list of startups like literally nobody's ever heard of. And I'm like, okay, well, how do you win against these folks? And they'll say, well, ease of use, man. Ease of use is our thing. Like if we're going to use these guys, it takes 15 clicks to do a thing. And with ours, it only takes 1 click. So we're way easier to use. And that's why you should use us. So I'll say, okay, so did you actually lose deals to these folks? And they'll say, no, we don't. I say, well, what would you do if you didn't exist? What would a customer do? And a lot of times the answer to that is, well, we just use a spreadsheet, or we do it manually with paper and processes, or we just hire an intern to do it. Now think about that. You're positioning your whole stuff around ease of use. This is easy. And if you're really competing with the intern, how are you ever going to beat the intern on ease of use? Like the intern's super easy to use. It's like, Joey, get me a coffee, fill out the spreadsheet, come back when you're done. So you actually need to understand the first step this in order to get your positioning right through all of the cascading things. So you have to really understand, like, what is your actual competitors, and then cascade it through. Anyways, positioning is a giant meaty topic. There's a lot of things that you can do in here that are right and wrong. If you're interested in this giant meaty topic, I wrote an entire book on the topic, and for $7 measly, or maybe if you're lucky, you'll win one later, you can get everything I know about this particular topic. So that's the first thing. Position in a way where you're fighting a fight you can win. That's the first way you beat the hordes. Here's the second way you beat the hordes. You teach your prospects how to buy. Now, this is, again, it's a thing that's not kind of obvious, but if you think about it, for most of us, we sell solutions to people that have never purchased a solution like ours before. Like I spent a lot of time in the CRM space, and we were selling CRM to buying teams that literally had never bought a CRM before. How often do you buy a CRM? You don't do it every day, right? So they've never bought one before. So they actually have no idea how to evaluate a CRM. So a key part of the purchase process is trying to make sense out of, how do I pick even a short list and figure this out? Now, I can look at slides like this. Is this helpful? No, that's not helping me figure it out. This is just a whole bunch of boxes and 7,000 things. This isn't going to help me figure it out. Even if let's say what I want is sales enablement software. Let's say that's what I'm looking for. I look at that big chart and I go, oh God, that's 8,000 things on there. I can't look at all that stuff, but there's a box on there that says sales enablement. Great. Okay, now I've narrowed it down. It's still pretty terrible, but I'm not looking at 8,000 anymore. I'm looking at a few dozen. So this is better, but this still isn't helping me look at, like, I got to make a short list. I can't evaluate all these things. There's way too many on there. I might Google around and I might end up at something like this. Like maybe I'll go to G2 Crowd and look at that. Now, is that any more helpful? Like, what if I'm a buyer? I look at this. What this tells me is what's popular, right? I got an axis that says market presence. But what if I'm little and I look at these and I'm like, you know what? These look like solutions for big companies. I'm not a big company. Or, gee, I need sales enablement. I'm a tech company, but these look like they're general purpose. I don't want a general purpose one necessarily, right? So here's the other thing. These evaluator sites like G2 Crowd or Software Advice, there's lots of them out there. They actually make money on market confusion. So they make money from people clicking around and they sell those leads to vendors. So the more confusing it is, the better. Here's the other thing. If you're a vendor in there, how do you move up and down this thing? I mean, yes, we can get a lot of people to go in and do the review, but bigger companies are always going to drift to the top over smaller companies. If you're a startup, do you really want a lead generator site to own the definition of my market? That doesn't seem very smart. So how can I actually help customers do this? Like, think about it. Customers are desperate for information about how do I make sense out of all these different choices in a market? Who's the expert on that? You are. The vendors are. Now people will say, well, look, I can't tell people what to do to think about in a market. I'm totally biased. Everybody knows I'm biased. Of course we know you're biased. Everybody knows we're biased. But you're biased but honest point of view on how to think about this market has the potential to be hugely helpful to customers that just need a big macro way to think about this. If you can do it in an honest way, that is commercial teaching, and customers love it. So I'll give you an example. I'm a vendor, I'm in this thing, and I'm like, oh, how does anybody ever figure out whether they should pick me versus all the things on this chart? I could actually, depending on my point of view on the market, just communicate, here's how I separate this. You make up your own mind. But for us, being in this space, here's how we split it out. So here's an example. This is a client that I work with. They're called Level Jump Software. They're in the sales enablement space, which is legitimately terrible and crowded. And so they made this little graphic, and it's really fun. And they shared it around on social, and it's called Sales Tech Explained Using Donuts. And so what they do is they've taken all the vendors and put them into their respective categories and then explain what those categories mean. So I have sales intelligence, which is I know who likes donuts, and that's Zoom Info and Inside View. And then I've got sales dialers. I only call people that like donuts, and that's Ring Central and 8x8. And I've got conversational intelligence. I see if I'm talking too much about donuts, that's Gong and Chorus and whatever. And then way down there, you can see where my guys Level Jump. They're under sales readiness / enablement, which is I train to become the master at selling donuts. And there's Level Jump, Mind Tickle, Learn Core. Now, what's cool about this is now I've given you a mental model. I've given you a mental model how to split this market in a way that actually makes sense to you as a customer. And for Level Jump, they don't mind being on the list with Mind Tickle and Learn Core because they know they can beat them. So they're like, you want a short list? If this is what you want, I train to become the master at selling donuts. It's me and these two other guys. That's it. Let me build the short list for you. Looks like this. If you want the other stuff, then don't pick me. I don't do that stuff. You'd be a bad lead for me anyway. They did another version of this where they took it like a map at the shopping mall and they split it into levels at the mall, which I thought was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it too. Like almost like the way we used to draw an architecture diagram. It's a bit like this. So, on the ground floor, we've got sales engagement. And then above that, we've got sort of corporate learning. And then if I'm doing sales enablement, that's kind of a level on top of that. And again, here's content management systems, they sit over here. But if what you really want is sales readiness, here's us, here's Learn Core, here's Mind Tickle, here's how it sits. So that's how to beat the hordes. So that's the first one. I got to kind of, give people a way to think about the market, help people understand when they should pick me over other options. That's the first thing I got to do. Then we get to the next thing. Okay, so, we've narrowed it down now. And what usually happens, not always, but in a lot of markets, you've got to fight against the giant, which is sort of the big one in the space. And so lots of markets have like the big undisputed leader in the space. Sometimes what you've got is they're not even really the leader in the space, but it's like, I could buy purpose-built software to do this, or I could kind of sort of get away with the kind of half-assed thing in my accounting package or in my ERP or in, something else. And so I do end up battling this big company. And so the interesting thing about that is you can actually position your competitors in the same way you position yourself. So I'm giving you a way to think about the market. Well, I can give you a way to think about the big guys too, in the same way I'm giving you a way to think about me. So, so here's how you beat the giant. So there's a couple ways. So one is you take their strength and you use it against them. Now, when we're at startups, sometimes we're scared to go against the big companies because they're like, oh my gosh, they're so big and they're so like, I'll get marketing teams telling me this in particular. They get all scared of the big guys and they'll be like, well, they're the market leader and they have all these reference customers. But here's what's interesting. Inside every strength is an inherent weakness that you can exploit. So if you're the big market leader and you say, our solution has been around forever, this is proven technology. Another way of saying that is this legacy shit. I used to work at a startup, but when we were competing with IBM, we were always like, do you want to go with the legacy stuff or do you want to go with us? This idea of market leading is another way of saying unspecialized or general purpose. When you say something is feature rich, so I actually did work at IBM as well at one point. And so, at IBM, some of our products, if you clicked on a drop down menu and there was literally like 100 things, 100 options on the drop down menu. And so a startup person would look at that and say, my God, there's all complexity, like this is terrible. Now IBM people would say it's actually feature rich, like look at all the different ways you configure it and it's super flexible. So one person's feature rich is another person's, oh, this is terrible, it's complex, right? Trusted by many can be interpreted as slow to innovate. So just because you have a competitor in your market that's really big and has things that may look like advantages to some companies, to other companies, those advantages actually look like minuses. And so you can exploit that. Here's an example. There's a company here in the edtech space called D2L, and they're one of the leaders in that space. They're, big, they've been around for a long time. And they had these little upstart folks showed up in their space a few years back called Canvas. And so Canvas was kind of selling to a little bit of a different buyer inside the education group. And they positioned themselves this way. Now, interestingly, like D2L, a very mature product, very, very feature-rich product. It had grown by acquisition to a certain extent, but they had just literally, you could do everything for everything. I mean, it's very mature, complete product. Canvas came in and said, you know what you want? You want something that doesn't have too much complexity. You want something sleek and nice. And they literally in their sales decks show this picture of like, it is nice Volkswagen Beetle. Like, look at it. It's so nice, easy to use, and it's all sleek and whatever. And then they'd say, and here's the other guys. They look like this. It's just a bunch of crap, just bolted on. It's just all kinds of stuff you don't even need. And they would essentially come in and take all the stuff that actually, to certain buyer look like a strength and turn it into, this is actually kind of a weakness. That's the first thing. So the first thing is, we can take the strengths and find the weakness in the strength for certain buyers. The second thing you can do is you let them win. Like, you let them win, but you don't let them win in your patch. So again, we often hesitate to do this, particularly, I don't know why more startups don't do this, to tell you the truth. Like, startups like to come in and say, there's no one else but us, and you should just pick us. And buyers are actually pretty sophisticated, and they know that there's other competitors out there, particularly if you've got a giant in your market. The customers have been looking at them. And so to not acknowledge them at all feels a little disingenuous. And so what you can do is you can just give them the parts of the market that you're not going to win anyway, but furiously defend your turf. So it gives you a way to acknowledge that the big guys exist, but you don't actually give them anything in your patch. So an example of this, and this is from years and years ago. I worked at this company and we did enterprise CRM, and this is, Salesforce was still selling at the low end of the market back then, but there was a big company in the space called Siebel. And so Siebel was big enterprise CRM. So our patch though, we sold specifically to investment banks. So when we went in and pitched to investment banks, we'd go in and we'd say, we're CRM for investment banks. And the bankers would be like, wait a second, isn't that what Siebel does? Like, aren't they CRM too? They're 2 billion revenue, right? We can't ignore them. So we're like, oh yeah, oh, Siebel. Love those guys. What an amazing company. Like, so many customers, so much revenue. So they're amazing. I think they're like the world's best general purpose CRM for like call centers in India and manufacturing plants and things like that, but not you, Wolf of Wall Street. You need something special. And so we've built something that's very purpose built for customers like you, and we only sell it to investment banks. This was a very credible thing to say. And what was interesting about it is we would kind of lay these landmines for the Siebel guys in the account. So we'd say, oh, they're super general purpose. Like they're going to come in here, they're going to show you a call center demo. And they did. Like they would come in to investment bankers and show them a call center demo. And so we'd lay that bomb and the Siebel guys would come in and step right on it. This worked very well for us until we got acquired by Siebel, and then we had to stop talking smack about them. So here's the last one. So I've managed to beat the hordes. So I've differentiated from the hordes. I've gotten past the giant, and now I've got to the last one. And the last one is the ghost. And what I mean by the ghost is last one's like status quo, do nothing. And it's weird how we don't think about that as competition directly, but in fact, it's generally our worst competition. So there's lots of interesting data around here if you go splunking around, but there's this really interesting survey that these guys, Richardson's, do every year. And so they do this survey of people that sell enterprise software, and then they talk to like enterprise software sales reps and they ask them like, you know, what are your customers struggling with, or what's the hardest thing in the buying cycle? And so these are the top 3 results here on the left. So 22% said building a case for change. Number 3 was combating the status quo. Like these are kind of the same, 2 sides of the same coin. It's like, how do I actually convince people that they should do anything different? Anything, not buying that thing, anything. Interestingly, number 2 is comparing their options. That's the whole thing I've been talking about since the beginning of this. We don't even know how to buy. I don't even know how to compare my options. But even if I do manage to get past comparing my options, I still got to beat status quo. So the other thing, there's all kinds of data on this, on like how many, on average, how many deals do we lose to no decision? 20% is this number that keeps floating around, but I can tell you at every company that I ever worked at, particularly where we sold enterprise software, that number was closer to 30. So we lose a lot to, you know, we've got a deal, it's gone all the way through the evaluation point, we've got all the way down to the actual buy part of the cycle, and then the customer's like, nah, can't pull the trigger. So how do we beat that? Interestingly, I think the best way to do this is to figure out a way to essentially hitch a ride on something else and catch some momentum on something else. And what this really means is figuring out, are there short-term priorities happening right now with your buyers? And how can you essentially take your positioning, but incorporate this like high priority stuff that's going on with your buyers. And so you're basically aligning with your buyer's priority to answer the question, not just why us, but why us right now. A couple of neat examples of this. One, this is a favorite company of mine, Sampler, and they're my favorite because I sit on a board. But what these folks do is they do digital product sampling. So if you ever like imagine a pre-COVID world, when you went to the grocery store, there were people in the grocery store handing out samples of cereal or cheese or snacks or whatever. Sometimes you'd see these people standing on the corner handing out physical samples of new candy or something like this. So in pre-COVID days, these folks were there. They're essentially a digital way of doing this that's way smarter, where you can actually match people to samples and then have those samples delivered directly to people. And then you get their email address. You can survey them afterwards and find out what they think about the sample. And so it's a million times smarter and more effective than just handing out samples to random people that you can't even really track. So their positioning was always around digital product sampling. So COVID hits. And in the very early days of COVID hitting, there was this kind of panic among consumer packaged goods brands of like, oh God, we're just going to stop everything. And then very quickly, the sentiment changed to like, we're going to have to actually do sampling in a contactless way. How the heck do we do that? And so Sampler very quickly shifted their positioning and started writing a lot of thought pieces and doing a lot of PR and being out there in the market talking about contactless product sampling. And, you know, there were all these articles about say goodbye to in-store sampling for things like makeup. Could you imagine going and using a lipstick tester in the day of COVID? No, thanks. We're not doing that anymore. And so they managed to sort of catch this wave very early into COVID when consumer packaged good brands were still like, we don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know how much of an impact this is going to have on our business. Sampler was there to say, hey, you know what you need? You need to make an investment in contactless product sampling. This is billions and billions of spend for these big consumer packaged good brands. So needless to say, their revenue goes skyrocketing. They raised a big round of financing in the middle of COVID, which is all pretty cool. Another example of this, it may be less zeitgeisty, is one of my favorite clients I ever worked with. These guys, they're in Cambridge in the UK. They're called Redgate Software. They're a great example of software that it isn't particularly sexy, and the answer to why now is often a bit of a struggle. So what these guys do is database tools. They've been around for ages. They have a giant suite of database tools, and they do really boring stuff like backup and recovery, data provisioning. They have 800,000 active customers. Like, I guarantee if you have an IT department, they're using some of Redgate stuff. So these guys have been around forever. They're fairly big. They noticed, and this was again a few years back, when the GDPR stuff was first started becoming a concern in Europe in particular. They noticed that two things happened when they were calling into accounts. They were noticing that their customers were saying, you know what, this isn't a priority. Your stuff isn't a priority this year. And then you'd say, well, what is a priority? And they'd be like, we're in the middle of a DevOps transformation over here. So they're spending a lot of money on DevOps consulting and looking at DevOps as a way to kind of handle this. You know, we've got GDPR stuff. We need to do this in a more procedural way. So the Redgate guys sort of looked at this and said, well, why aren't we part of a DevOps transformation? We're obviously part of a DevOps transformation. They just weren't positioning it that way. So they developed what I would call a point of view around how does database stuff link to DevOps, and did a lot of writing and speaking and being out in the market talking about this concept called database DevOps. So what is it? Why do you need it? Why are all this database stuff important in a DevOps transformation? So they essentially took the product that they had and aligned it with this high profile, high priority thing. The result of that was that there's a bunch of neat results of it. One was all of a sudden their stuff that was a little sleepy became kind of sexy. Like, it's a thing that happens when you're kind of like aligned with a trend. All of a sudden your stuff becomes like, this is a hot thing right now. You got to have this thing right now. Their inbound leads went up by 100%, which is actually massive when you're already a big company. The other thing was it gave them a way to tell a story that kind of strung all their products together in a better way. So they went from, you know, on a typical sales call, they were selling one product or two products to on average selling 3 products, 5 products, 6 products in an account at a single time, because they had this kind of neat story that brought it together. And that's it. That's all I got to say. Here's my summary. So here's how I think you win against competition in these 3 different ways. So first, you got the horde. So how am I going to stand out from everybody else? I got to deliberately position my stuff so that I'm making sure I'm fighting a game I can win. Secondly, how do I get over the giant? I gotta like turn their strengths into weaknesses, and I gotta give them something, let them win in some pieces, but just not in my patch. And then lastly, how do I compete against the ghost or status quo? The best way is I take that positioning, but I figure out how to align it with the key priorities that my customers have right now. This is me. You can send me an email. I'm April at aprildunford.com if you have burning questions, although we're going to do questions right now. I'm on Twitter at aprildunford. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to being a box on your screen.
Awesome, April. Thank you so much for that great talk. I love how you started out with the tangible examples of the Cakepop and the robot. Those are great. That's awesome. And you must be, are you like a movie buff? You have these amazing movie pictures in all your slides.
Well, you know what? I started out with a thing that I was like, I was going to build a whole presentation with just pictures of The Rock.
Mm-hmm.
That was the original idea. And then I don't know. And then it just kind of turned into like action movies.
That's great. Somebody commented that not only do you get good advice from April, you get like the movie, great movie action thriller stuff. So it's great. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you for a great talk with a lot of great advice and awesome examples.